Hello, everybody. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. We're going to give some more folks time to jump on. Oh, I can't. I don't think I want to. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Angela Barger. I am the manager of the Environmental Stewardship Initiative program. Welcome to our overview of the ISO 14001 2015 standard. Over the next several afternoons, you'll be hearing from myself and my coworkers, Dawn Burke, wave Dawn, our membership and outreach coordinator, and our boss, Marcia Alaco. She is the Environmental Assistance Section Chief of the Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service. And we also have Scott Pfister, our program consultant, who will be assisting. He has not so great internet, so he's not on video right now, but he's there in the background. And this training is typically 2 full days in a classroom, but we're going to be breaking it up over the next 4 afternoons for you. We would definitely be remiss if we didn't also thank the Waste Reduction Partners and the Land of Scott Regional Council for hosting this training on their GoToWebinar software. They've been wonderful partners for us as we have shifted so much of our content, our outreach, and our training to this online format. So just a few housekeeping items before we dig into today's topic. If you have audio issues and are using the audio through your computer, you can switch to your telephone. Just go to the audio tab and you'll see this where you can click phone call, and it will give you a phone number and a code there. That information is also in the emails that you have received with the reminder. So if you can't get it to work that way, then you can go to your email and look at it. We are recording today's session, and for the next few days, we'll be recording those sessions as well. And we will send those links to the recordings out to you. We are not the ones who edit off the front end and back end of us chatting. So it might take a few days for those to go out, but we will be recording them and we will be sending them out to you. So if you miss a class or you have to jump off early or whatever, because these are long sessions, you will have access to that information. At various points in the training, we will refer you to exercises or other documents. You should see those in your webinar toolbar. Down at the bottom, there should be a little drawer that says Handouts, and there are currently 5 handouts in there. So if at some point while we're talking you want to go ahead and download those, we have already talked about the fact that there's a limit of 5 handouts that we can actually upload at a time. So those will be changing out. Some will stay there the whole time, some will change. The one that will stay there the whole time is the Design Guidance Workbook. This is a document that we created that goes through the entire ISO 14001 standard. So if you don't have a system in place, this is our effort to help you work through that. This is a PDF version. We have an Excel version that is available to our ESI members that is actually more of an interactive workbook for them. But everybody has availability to look at the PDF version. And then these other things are either exercises or forms or that kind of thing. And like I said, we will be switching those out as needed. All right. To prevent feedback and unintended background noise, all attendees are muted. However, we want you to ask questions and share verbally. So in order to facilitate that, we will ask that you raise your hand when you want to speak. Be sure to mute yourself only through the GoToWebinar software using the little microphone button at the top of the control bar. It should be red when it's muted and green when live, so it should default to muted. We can unmute you to speak from here. So if you raise your hand, then we can just click the unmute button for you. But to reduce time and fumbling through the controls, just make sure that you only use that button instead of your phone or your computer to mute. So let's practice hand raising. I know this is kind of an unusual feature for some folks. So basically, you'll see that little hand on the control panel. Clicking it will send us a notice that you would like to speak, and then we can use this feature for quick polls also. So let's try that right quick just to get people some experience with the hand raising. So raise your hand if your organization already has a functioning environmental management system. Okay, Don, what you seeing?
A good majority have responded. I only see maybe 3 or 4 that do not have their hands raised.
Okay, great. Okay, now put everybody's hands down. Don can do that for you. You don't have to do it yourself.
They're down.
All right. Now raise your hand if you are new to environmental management systems completely. Okay, what we've got there?
Yeah, looks like we've got about half dozen people.
Okay, great. Welcome. This will be fun. Hopefully we don't overwhelm you. All right, you can put everybody's hands down again.
Okay.
All right, and we encourage you to raise your hand anytime. When we do this class live in our offices, we encourage people to interrupt us. So raise your hand whenever you hear something that you want us to talk about. We're very laid back in our training format. So please let us know as soon as you have a question. If you're not comfortable talking over the internet this way, feel free to use the chat box as well. So Scott will be monitoring both the hand raising and the chat box as we go along today, along with Dawn. And most of today, after I finish talking, is going to be Marcia. So just so you're aware of whose voices you're hearing and when. All right, so let's get started. For those of you who are not familiar with our program, the Environmental Stewardship Initiative is a voluntary assistance and recognition program. It's been part of the Department of Environmental Quality in North Carolina since 2002 and is administered by the Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service. We are partially funded by an EPA pollution prevention grant and promote environmental management systems to assist organizations in their efforts to continually improve their environmental footprints. We also encourage and facilitate networking and training events that allow for peer sharing between our members on a wide range of environmental topics. If you're not yet a member and you'd like more information, please email Dawn or I. We'd be happy to share more information with you and answer any questions you might have. There's no cost to join. All we ask is an annual report on the progress you make towards those environmental goals. And here's a fun splash screen showing all of our current membership. And we'd love for you to be on this slide. So now let's get into the real reason you're here, the ISO 14001 standard. All right. So ISO 14001 is based on the Plan, Do, Check, Act model of continual improvement. You may hear the PDCA model, you may hear it called the Deming cycle, but basically it's all the same thing, that Plan, Do, Check, Act. When you're looking at that in relationship to the ISO 14001 standard, what you've got are multiple elements that fall within each one of those sections. So you've got the planning section, which talks about environmental aspects. Think of those as your environmental impacts. They use weird language, so if you're not used to it, thinking about aspects as the impacts can help. Compliance obligations, and then planning how you're going to address those. Then you've got your environmental objectives, so those are your environmental goals, and how you're going to work towards those goals. In the check section, you've got those support operations. So what resources do you have? Competence of your employees, the awareness of the EMS, communication, both internal and external, documented information. So that's the whole document control piece. And then your operations, so operational control and emergency preparedness and response. Under the check, you've got performance evaluation pieces like monitoring and measuring, evaluation of your compliance, internal auditing, and management review. And then under ACT, you've got non-conformance and corrective action systems, and of course, that continual improvement commitment. Now, the 2015 version of the standard, for those of you who've looked at 2004, have 2 additional elements that could fall within planning, but we look at them more as a framework piece because typically you do this at the beginning, and while you might look at it during management review or if something big happens, they're much higher level pieces that don't need as much attention on a regular basis as the rest of it. So those include the context of your organization, which is a new concept to the ISO standard, and Marcia's going to talk about that today. Understanding the needs and interests of your interested parties, determining your scope, and then the leadership pieces where you're talking about your leadership commitment and their commitment to the standard itself and what their roles are, what your environmental policy is, and then your organization's roles, responsibilities, and authorities. Again, for those of you who have a version, the previous version of the ISO system in place or have recently converted, this is the difference in how it looks. So the 2004 version only had 6 pages, whereas the 2015 version now has 11 pages long. They've done a lot of rearranging of where the elements actually are, splitting some things up, adding some additional elements, changing the language so that it matches with other ISO standards. So if you decided to do an integrated system between your quality, your environmental, your safety, and all of those others ISO standards that you could potentially manage your facility with, now they fall in the same order, and therefore when you're creating a policy, you could do an integrated policy and it would all fall under that same element number, just to make things a little bit better for you organizational wise. The old standard had 18 elements. The newer one has 32. There used to be 12 mandatory documents or records. There's now 15. And while you used to have only 60 shall statements, which are those things that you have to do according to the ISO guidance, now you have 80 shall statements. Some of those, like I said, are duplicates. So it might say the same thing in different places within the standard. So while there are more of them, a lot of times it's the same thing twice. So just don't freak out if you see that huge jump in the number of shall statements. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Marcia.
Yep, and
she's got it for most of the day.
All right, so rather than having you guys stare at me where you actually see the side of my head because I've got 3 monitors going, I've turned off my webcam.
And I am going to do the same.
All righty, so is everyone seeing the Annex A slide? Angela and Don, can you verify?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so it's good to know that we have some newbies to the ISO standard. So usually the way that folks get a hold of the standards, either they get the printed out version or the electronic version. And so what Angela was just going over, there are different requirements, but there are 2 really important sections of the standard that go along with these shells and all the other things. The first one is called, am I one too far? Yeah, hold on. This is the part of the on 3 screens. There we go. I jumped to one. Sorry about that. One too far. So the first part is they define the terms and definitions, which is in section 3. So remember, this is environmental management system. It's the requirements and the guidance for you. So part of that guidance is these terms and definitions. So for example, 315 defines top management as the person or group of people who directs or controls an organization at the highest level. And then if they have any additional information that they want to give, they'll put those notes for entry into the either in the definitions or in the annex, which we'll discuss in a minute. So this one is 2 notes. So it says top management has the power to delegate, but they must provide the resources within the organization for the EMS. And then the other one is that the scope of the EMS covers only part of an organization, then the top management refers to those who direct and control that part. So just wanted everyone to be aware that there are a large number of terms and definitions in the beginning of the standard, and they give you guidance about how those should be implemented in those note to entries. And then the other great section of the standard is the annex. So there, I think there's an A, B, and possibly a C. I haven't looked at it in a little while. So it gives you, this is where they provide the guidance on how to implement the different concepts that they discuss. So let's say in section A3, it clarifies some concepts, and you'll hear us try and also clarify the concepts as we go through the next 4 days. But if you have an actual copy of the standard, it's good to look at all of the different concepts that they tried to clarify. So you'll hear us use the words consider and take into account. So those mean 2 different things. When the standard refers to consider, it means that it's necessary to think about a topic, but it can be excluded. Whereas where they say take into account means it is necessary to think about the topic, but it cannot be excluded. And then the word ensure means that the responsibility can be delegated, but not the accountability. So that sort of circles back to leadership, and we'll go over that. Let's see. All right. And those are in the annex. It has guidance for each of the different clauses. Okay. So as Angela said, the first part of the standard starts off with context, and these are new. If you're someone who's been around EMS for a while and you switch from 2004 to 2015, you'll know that context, leadership, those sections have been added, and that's to make sure, as Angela noted, if you have a quality standard or the health and safety or the energy standard, that those are the same, and they're always referred to as the same section, so it makes it easier for an organization to implement more than one ISO standard. Okay. That's so I was just saying to myself, it's really strange. So we can see the slides when they're presenting, and I had half a green screen and half a blue. Now it's finally turned blue. All right, in the context of the organization, there's 4 sections. So 4.1 is understanding your organization in its context. 4.2, which is also new, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, and we'll define those. The old version of the standard did have determination of the scope of your EMS, so that's not new. And then they had another section called environmental management system, but it's spelled out a little differently than the older version. And I think Angela said this, if you have a question at any time, please raise your hand. We'd rather that you ask your question as we go along to make sure you're understanding the concepts, because Angela likes to say it, and I don't think she did today, we're feeding you through a fire hose, so you're going to get a lot of information, especially if you've not seen the standard before. So, all right, so one of the big things with the new version of the standard is introducing the concept of sustainability into ISO 14001. So I'm sure everyone's aware, with increased societal expectations, a lot of companies use, we're green or something, there's society expects people to be looking at the environment as they run their business. And ways that can be looked at as, sustainable development, transparency in what you're doing, accountability for what you're doing. It could be increasingly stringent legislation on an organization, pressure on the environment from pollution, improper waste management, which some organizations do. Thankfully, none of the ones that I've been involved with that have EMSs in place are ones that would do that. And there is degradation of the ecosystem just as we live on Earth, and loss of biodiversity. So some of the ways that the standard tries to incorporate sustainability is, protecting the environment by mitigating or preventing the adverse environmental impacts that an organization may have on the environment. Also, and we'll talk about this in a minute, and mitigating the potential adverse effects of the environmental conditions on the organization. So circling that back around. The EMS standard is designed to help an organization fulfill its compliance obligations, to help them enhance their environmental performance. And then also a lot of times when folks, put those green initiatives in place, they may achieve some financial or other operational benefits that can result from changing up how an organization interacts with the environment. And that may enable an organization to, if it's a for-profit, increase their market position or enable them to market themselves in a way that's different. An EMS will enable an organization to change how they respond to environmental conditions in balance with sustainability, and communicating your environmental information. All right, so one of the ways that specifically in the standard sustainability comes up, so organizational context, how your organization affects and is affected by the environment, society, and economics, helps you identify who those interested parties are to what you do and how you affect the environment. We're going to introduce the life cycle perspective. So it's not a full-on life cycle on your products or your services, but it's more of a perspective and looking at all those different stops within the life cycle and how your organization affects them or could be affected by them. Angela will discuss risks and opportunities. So that's new, looking at the positive and possibly the negative ways in which you affect the environment, the environment affects you, or how your EMS or your organization is positively or negatively influenced. There's a bigger push at leadership, so a big commitment by top management within this new version of the standard. And they want you to have increased alignment of your EMS with the strategic direction of the organization, which is those decisions that are made by top management. So that all fits together nicely. All right, so organizations don't operate in a bubble. So your organizational context is really a high-level conceptual understanding of where you are. And I think with COVID, recently a lot of businesses figured out where economically where they fit in, right? We made decisions about who was essential and who was not essential. And that really affected a lot of businesses' bottom line. So understanding your context, issues that could affect you either positively or negatively in the way your organization manages its environmental responsibility. So we're just putting on our environmental hats here when we're talking about context. There could be lots of different ways your organization can be affected by society, but we're just looking at the environmental ones with your EMS. And the other thing about learning your environmental context, it can impact successful implementation of an EMS, because one of the things we're going to talk about is you're not only looking at external issues, you're looking at internal issues. Gotta find my mouse. All right, so the standard says an organization shall determine the external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and that affect its ability to achieve the intended outcomes of your environmental management system. These issues shall include the environmental conditions being affected by or capable of affecting the organization. So some of the external issues and how they could affect your EMS. So it could affect the scope, what is going to be included in your EMS. It could affect what compliance obligations are covered by your EMS, how you're going to communicate both internally and externally about your EMS, and it could affect your budget. Internal issues that can affect your organization It's going to determine how your EMS is designed, how your organizational structure is set up, how it's going to be implemented, what goals you're going to set, and how you're going to continually improve your EMS. All right, so specifically section 4.1 discusses external issues. So it says you need to identify the external issues that may be relevant to your purpose and could affect your organization. So some of the examples could include cultural, societal, political, right? If laws change, that's going to affect you. Legal, if depending on what you do, you could be affected by specific regulations. Financial, as we learned, COVID-19, technology, economic, natural and competitive circumstances. And they could be national, regional, or local in nature. And then 4.2 discusses the internal issues. So those could include, what activities, products, and services does your organization, are you involved with? What is the strategic direction of your organization? What is your internal culture and capabilities? Those could affect how your EMS is put in place. So your workforce, institutional knowledge, what's the age breakdown of your employees? What are your processes? Are they, defined? Do you have SOPs, or is it more verbal? How you do your training, what your budget's looking at, and if you're part of a corporation, what are those corporate requirements? All those things could internally affect your organization in EMS. And the last part of context was about your environmental conditions. So in the 2004 version of the standard, it was really one-sided. It had you look at how your organization affects the environment. Whereas in contrast, the 2015 standard asks you to not only look at how you affect the environment, but how the environment could affect you. And, some of the organizations were looking at that, but this puts that requirement in place. It's one of those shall statements. So what are some of the things that could affect an organization? So it could be climate change, air quality, water quality, land use, if there's existing contamination, natural resource availability, and then how can it can affect your organization's mission, environmental, your aspects. It could play a role in that life cycle perspective that you're going to start looking at. So. All right, so one of the things that we did, Angela mentioned, was we had a design guide. So it's designed for anyone who does not have an EMS already in place. And it takes someone through all the steps that we think that you would need to complete to implement an EMS. So one of the things that we put into that design guidance was this food for thought, and we'll have you use this in a little bit with an example. But it gives you examples of the different, internal, external, environmental considerations that can affect you. And it just gives you an opportunity to think about some things that you may not have thought about as you're looking at your context. And we do ask that, a lot of our members have used this when they first had to put a context in place. And so they've given us feedback. If you see anything in here or you think of something that's not in here, just let us know, because then that's great for other people as we go forward. All right. So when you have to complete the organization of your context, you need to determine how you're going to identify the internal, external issues that are relevant to your EMS. So who within your organization is going to be involved? Is it going to be your, mainly your ES&H staff and your top leadership? Or we had one of our members, the ES&H staff came up with a draft context, and then every manager, when they had EMS training, they all sat down and reviewed it and came up with, additional suggestions about, what could also be included in the context. And then I don't think we mentioned it on that summary slide. We had the shall statements, but there are also different points in the standard where it requires you to document different things. So one of the things that you're going to have to think about is that documentation of your context is not required by the standard. So, but it does ask you to take the context into consideration on a number of different items. So you need to be able to reference how you came up with that and then discuss how your context changes. All right, so where are the different places in the standard that reference the organizational context? You have to think about it when you're developing the scope of your EMS, so what's going to be included in your EMS. Your environmental policy and your environmental objectives, or what we call your goals, must be compatible with the context of your organization. And the standard requires you to consider your organizational context when you plan for your EMS, when you identify those risks and opportunities to the organization and the EMS, and when you review changes to your internal and external issues during the management review. So this review changes is one of the big things that is something to consider, as I said, about how or if you document your EMS in your context, I mean. All right, so some examples. I think I have about 4 different examples of how our members have implemented the context. So for those organizations that have an EMS manual, you could put it in your EMS manual, which is what our member Uchiyama did. So they have context, and then they broke it down where they talk about external issues, and this is just a screenshot. So later on, they talk about internal issues, and then talk about environmental items that can affect or be affected by the organization. The NC Zoo, which is one of our stewards, they actually put this into a procedure. So it spells out their context. And this was their external section of their SOP, which talks about that they have this, I think it's on this top part, Zoological Park Council. So they actually have an outside group that helps them with making decisions, which is important to their context. Firestone combined it with doing their environmental aspects. And then they put it into this, they made this pestle word up, so that sort of looks at that political, economic, societal, technological, legal, and ecological issues and how they affect their aspects. All righty. So did anybody have any questions on context? Okay, and I don't think I had it on that screen. We had one other member that we had gone out and done a functionally equivalent EMS audit on, and they did a SWOT analysis. So their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And we thought that was a really interesting way to look at your context, but also that strategic direction of your organization was also wrapped up into that. Okay. Without any questions, we're going to roll into section 4.2, which is understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. So interested parties is a new term in the standard, and it's defined in section 3 as a person or organization that can be affected by, or perceive itself to be affected by a decision or activity. And for an interested party to perceive itself to be affected, it means that they make that perception known to the organization. So either they've called in or they sent a letter, or somehow the organization knows that this person is interested in their organization and how they affect the environment in their EMS. So who could be interested in your EMS? So internally, that could be employees. That could be contractors if you have them coming on your site on a fairly often basis. If you're a public company, that could be investors or your corporate oversight. That would be the management team at the facility and also your suppliers. Whereas external interested parties could be the entities, the consumers of your product or your service, any regulators that you have, if you were a member of a trade group, neighbors if you have them that are close to your site, elected officials, your community that your facility or your site is located in, and then environmental advocates. And one thing we tell folks is to always remember to look at your complaints or if you've won awards or commendations as additional areas to look for interested parties. Especially if you're a public entity. We went out and with one of our members, we were chatting with them, and they have or they had an external advisory group. Although the agreement with them has expired, they still work with that group as if it was still in place. And so we said, well, those are interested parties. They had some local agreements with some other local municipalities. Those are interested parties. So interested parties could be more complex for certain organizations. So the standard requires you to determine who your interested parties are, both internally and externally, that are relevant to your EMS. And then from that, figure out what their needs and expectations are, what we call their requirements of those interested parties. And then there's a choice that needs to be made. So you get to decide which of these needs and expectations becomes a compliance obligation. And we'll define that in just a moment. Okay, so the standard defines a compliance obligation as your legal requirements that you have to comply with and any other voluntary requirements that you choose to comply with. And those were mentioned in the 2004 version of the standard. The new standard just combines them and says both of those shall be known as your compliance obligations. So mandatory ones come from laws, regulations, or administrative codes, whereas voluntary ones, it could be within your organization. So let's say, if corporate is requiring you to do something, or if it's an industry standard. It could be a requirement that is set by a contractual relationship with someone or an agreement with a community group. So think about all of those items when you think about your compliance obligations. And we always like to say, if you're an EMS member, you have a compliance obligation to us to submit that annual report. All right, so just like your context, you'll need to determine how you come about developing that list of who is your interested parties and what their expectations and needs are. You need to determine which of those will become a compliance obligation for you. And then just like the context, the standard does not require you to document this. So you make a decision about how, if you're going to document it, and then how you're going to show that evidence to someone, either an outside certifying body, or if we come in and do an FE, a functionally equivalent audit. So where are interested parties and compliance obligations referenced in the standard? So you have to consider them when developing your scope. Your policy and your scope must be made available to interested parties. So that's new. The old standard said you will make a decision about how you make it available. Now it says that they shall be available, and that includes your scope. It requires you to provide relevant information and training related to emergency preparedness and response as appropriate to interested parties or those working under your control. And we'll go over that concept later on, what is considered working under your control. It requires that you consider your interested parties and their compliance obligations when you plan for your EMS, identify the risks and opportunities to your organization in the EMS, and when you consider changes to those needs and expectations of interested parties during your management review. All right, so we're gonna go through a little exercise because I don't think we have any questions at this point. All right, so Whoop, let's go back one. All right, so on your control panel, Angela mentioned early on that we have those handouts. So if you'll click on the little caret next to handouts, you'll see 5 of them. And if you'll need the Excel sheet that says Lone Mountain exercise. So after I show you some slides about this fictitious site, Lone Mountain Mining, we're going to have you complete this exercise. And then the other thing you have for your use is that food for thought. Go ahead, I hear somebody.
Marcia, this is Don. We do have a hand raised from Christopher Lott.
Okay.
Christopher, your mic is live.
Hey, Angela, do you have any examples of how 4.2 is done throughout industry? I'd just like to see some examples of how, if you have any available.
Yeah, so interested parties. So a lot of times we have seen it, if they have an EMS manual, they'll have a paragraph about the interested parties there. But a lot of times, because you start with your interested parties and then roll into those compliance obligations, most folks have a listing or a table of compliance obligations, and they note in there who the interested party is. Angela or Don, anything else? I think those are the 2 main areas where we've seen interested parties, either the manual or in that compliance obligation listing.
Yeah, that's normally where it's documented. Some also will use their management review to document those, so it might be within the minutes of the management review, since the documentation piece isn't necessarily required.
Yeah. Good question. All right, so let me advance again. We're there. So if you need it, remember those food for thought and the Lone Mountain Mining. So I am going to pull up another presentation. Bear with me a second. Is everybody seeing the Lone Mountain Mining presentation now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Except my control panel has now gone away for some reason on that one. There is a beauty of doing multiple screens, and then there's times like this where it disappears and you're like, where did it go to? All right. Okay. So Lone Mountain Mining is a 90-year-old limestone mine and processing operation located in the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains. It's been operating under the current management for the past 15 years. Ooh, hold on. How do I? Sorry, folks, I'm going to mute myself so you don't hear that. Sorry about that. It took a little longer than usual to go to voicemail. All right. Let's see. So there are currently 40 employees, and the mine operates year-round, Monday to Friday during the day. The sizing, or the breaking down of the limestone into the size where they can sell it, is carried out during the evenings to obtain lower electricity rates. And equipment maintenance is conducted on weekends as needed. The mine has coverage under an NPDES, so that's just a part of the Clean Water Act, if you're not familiar with that term, permit for both its treated wastewater and its industrial stormwater. And the facility carries an air permit exemption due to its production rate. The mine has 2 significant customers. So the mine sells its limestone to the agricultural business, which is used as a soil treatment, and that's a less demanding customer base that is seasonal in nature. And the mine's main customer, limestone, is sold to the glass industry, and that must meet demanding color specifications requiring chemical additions, and that customer is year-round for the mine. So here on slide 1, you see the entrance road into the mine. So in the closeness of some of the neighbors, you can see the tops of those buildings there. They are in condominiums, which are not inhabited year-round. And the trucks that you see there are provided by the mine's customers, and they come on site to transport that finished lime back to where they're going to use it. All right. Okay, go to slide 2. Thank you. All right, this is the narrow 2-lane access road into the mining area. The mine is an elevation of about 2,500 feet and it's heavily forested with oak trees. It usually snows during the winter at this elevation. Okay. There are several signs on the mine property reminding the truck drivers that the mine's neighbors are sensitive to noise from the trucking operations. And they also note the speed limit and that jake brakes or engine compression braking systems should not be used while they're on site. This is the closest neighbor that lives in their home year-round. Like I said, the area surrounding the mine is somewhat remote and it's filled with wildlife. And it's not unusual to see some of that wildlife as the trucks come around the roads. This is a storage area and the blending silos. And it also shows the truck preparation area where the truckers stop to wash off their trucks to minimize the dust that they create. The mining operation is an open pit mining process where the limestone is removed from the substrate by blasting. And so the signs caution visitors about blasting operation and that the use of their radios is prohibited as they may detonate the explosive charges. This is the main office area for the mine. So just, nothing fancy going on. This just shows a picture of the terraced mining operation, and it's terraced to reduce erosion. Core samples are taken to determine the limestone chemistry and the blending that will be required to achieve that desired chemistry for the mine's glass industry customers. And this shows you a picture of the first step in the size reduction process. So it starts out as larger rocks and then it goes through different processes to get that down to the size that is needed. Okay. Limestone is transported from various operations on site via conveyor belt, and some of those areas are covered, but not all of them. These are the loadout bins containing, oh, no, sorry, skipped one. This shows additional views of the sizing and the crushing operations, including the storage areas for blending of the final product. Material that falls from the conveyor system is reclaimed and reintroduced into the process. These are the loadout bins containing the finished products that loads into the trucks that are provided by the mine's customers. And this is just an example picture of a truck being loaded and what that area would look like. So dust is often a problem generated through the mining, the sizing, the blending, and the distribution. So this could be a regulatory concern as well as a health and safety concern for the mine, its employees, but also visitors and possibly the neighbors. And water is used as dust control on site. All right. This is a view of the maintenance buildings in the area where the small sacks of limestone are provided to customers. And this is just showing some additional storage and maintenance areas and the size of the trucks that are used on site. This shows the pond where the process wastewater is routed for treatment. So process wastewater is any water that's used in the mining process itself. The limestone is washed to remove soil and clay, and flocculant is added to help precipitate sediment and debris. And the treated wastewater is discharged through what they call Outfall 1 to Sky Blue Lake. The pond is mucked out periodically to ensure adequate treatment volume, and the resultant sediment is used in mine reclamation. All right, and as I just mentioned, it's a fairly remote area, and parts of the mine overlook a river that has been dammed up about a mile downstream. And so this is showing you Sky Blue Lake, which is used as a recreational area for both trout and bass fishing. All right, so that is Lone Mountain Mining. And so I am going to open up that Excel file. Let me just bring that onto the screen where you guys can see that. Dawn and Angela, can you just verify that they see this?
I can see it.
Okay, perfect. So if you open up that Lone Mountain exercise, you will get this Excel file. So what we wanted to have you do, giving you this fictitious company, Lone Mountain Mining, is to think about those 3 items that you would have to identify when you're doing the context of the organization. So what we'd like you to take about 10 minutes, so it's about 10 to 2 until about 2 o'clock, is to think about and try and come up with an example for each one of those. So what is an environmental aspect or impact from the mine, or the way that the environment could affect the mine? What is an internal issue that could affect the organization in implementing their EMS, and what's an external factor? So come up with each one of those. And then I mentioned, what are other areas of the standard that require you, that look at the context? So one of those is in the planning section, and Angela will discuss this, is looking at the risks and opportunities. And you only have to document those risks or opportunities that you feel you need to do something about. But we just left space when we originally did this for you to start thinking about like risks and opportunities as it relates to your EMS. So now that I've said that, does anybody have any questions? Do you understand what we're asking you to do?
I'm not seeing any hands raised or questions, Marcia.
Okay. All right, guys. So if you'll come up with one environmental aspect related to the context, one internal and one external. And then when we come back, we'll have everybody share what they came up with. All right, so you'll hear my voice again in about, let's say 2 after 2, we'll come back and give you a full 10 minutes to work on that. All right, so the voice will come from the beyond, not to scare anybody. So if you'll raise your hand if you not done yet and you want a couple more minutes.
We have
All
one
right.
hand raised, Marcia.
Okay. So we'll give you another minute or two. And then what we do in class, so we ask for volunteers to share their ideas. So, all right, so the hand has gone away. All right, so let's break this down. Who would like to share with the class an example of an environmental issue related to the context for Lone Mountain mining?
Marcia, we have Bruce Helwig. Bruce, your mic is open.
Bruce, are you there? I'm not hearing you.
Groundwater contamination, did you hear?
Oh, yep.
What?
Groundwater contamination is perfect. That's a great example. So,
Yeah, because I
mine,
look at that sludge pit and then there's the river nearby. That's a big issue, I would think.
right. So, talking about groundwater contamination, would that be a risk or an opportunity or both for the mine?
It could be both. I mean, risk is the one that flashes red at me, but it could also be an opportunity.
Yep, it could be, right? So if they, let's say they did have an issue with their groundwater, but they were proactive and they've got, a plan in place, they can then share that with the neighbors and, positively be seen as, a good corporate citizen.
Right, I agree.
Okay, great, Bruce. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Did anyone else have another environmental one? All righty. What about an external factor related to the context for Lone Mountain mining? All right.
Oh, we've got a few here. I'll start with Christopher Lotz. Whoops, let me check that.
Is it not doing it?
No, Christopher's mic's not opening. Let me try Charles.
Okay.
Charles Saunders, your mic is live.
Yeah, I got blasting, the blasting in the area for external, plus the internal really, but.
Yep, so it could be external related to, let's say, the neighbors, right? So
Yes.
how they perceive the mine manages the blasting operations. So good.
Okay. And we have Sydney Swain. Sydney, your mic is live.
Hi, yes. My external one was like environmental quality, like Department of Environmental Quality for whatever area that is. So whatever regulatory requirements there are.
Yep. And would that be a risk or an opportunity or both?
I would say it's both, because it's like a risk if you're not doing what you're supposed to do, right? So it's a risk to your organization. But then also opportunity to collaborate with, regulators to make sure you are staying on top of what it is you're doing. You have a good relationship with your inspectors so that y'all can feed off each other, get information from each other, to make sure, instead of it always being like a negative, interaction, it can be positive and kind of doing some information sharing and things like that. So I think it's both.
Yes, perfect. Awesome. All right, so the only one we haven't talked about,
Yeah, just a note, Christopher Lotz mic is also self-muted on Christopher's end. So if you want to unmute on your end, we might be able to hear you. But until then, we could go on, Marcia.
Okay. And then the last one was an internal factor that could affect an organization, low mountain mining's organization. Did anybody have any thoughts on that one?
Yes, we have, is it Leanne Hayford? You're open?
Yes. I have employee safety, explosive and limestone crusher for the noise, which is a risk for the safety compliance obligations for adequate hearing protection.
Yep. So depending on whether that organization has rolled their safety into their EMS, because sometimes folks do and sometimes they don't, but that's great. Yep. And would that be a risk or an opportunity or both?
Risk.
Okay. Very good.
Okay, Marcia, it looks like Christopher Locke got through us on the question
Okay.
box. It's got dust generated from blasting. Could silica exposure could be high?
Yes.
And cause overexposure.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, good. You guys were thinking about low mountain mining. So let me close this down. And actually, we couldn't, we had that 5 limit to our documents that we could put up. So when we first.
And Bruce Helwig had another one typed in on the question box. Safety training also. It could be an internal opportunity.
Yes, definitely. Great. You guys are really thinking about low mountain mining. So I was saying we couldn't put more than 5 handouts out. So I have this filled out with a bunch of different examples, and we'll send that out to you guys. So some of the other things that I thought of was natural resource availability for the mine. So how much limestone is left? Will they need to expand the mine, right? So how are the neighbors going to handle that? So risk business viability, if they're running out of space and they can't expand, also a risk from the environmental impacts that they'll have, but an opportunity if they can expand, that keeps the business open longer. So that was what did I have that under? Environmental. So under external, we like our students to be creative. So I came up that there was legacy contamination from a previous owner, where they tried to mine other materials, and so they have an escrow account set up. So the risk from your residual contamination, may bring increased remediation requirements. Regulatory requirements may change. That's an external risk, right? Not only working with your regulators, but if there's a movement afoot to change, how the world operates, that will be done through regulations. And then I came up with glass production has been up, right? We all want new cell phones, new gadgets. Right now, everybody needs a laptop or a computer to do online classes, working from home. So glass production is up. So if they have to increase their production, that may require them to get new permits. Remember, they're under an exemption for air quality, whereas an opportunity for that is that should provide for some stability for sales from the mine. And then internally, what did I have in there? So I made up one was a language barrier, Polish versus English. So I'm half Polish, so that's where that one comes from. But that's something that a lot of our members do experience, other languages. I think we had a steward on our webinar we did for our members last week that they have to translate both to Spanish and French. We have some members that have employees that are hard of hearing. So all those internal factors to your organization that can affect how your EMS is implemented. And then I just put that your production manager and geologist are nearing retirement age. So that speaks to, are your processes documented? Are you transferring that important information about how your organization is successful? So those are some of the things to think about when you're looking at context of your organization. All right, so we can close that one down. Okay. All right, so we're gonna move on. Okay, I click the button. Come on, computer. There we go. Okay, so under 4.3, it discusses determining the scope of your EMS, so what is going to be included in it, and it says that the organization shall determine the boundaries and the applicability of the EMS to establish its scope, and you shall consider the following. So remember, you need to think about it, but it can be excluded. So you need to consider your external and internal issues defined in 4.1, which is your context of your organization. Those compliance obligations that you defined when looking at your interested parties, your organizational units, their functions, and the physical boundaries, your activities, products, and services, and then your authority and ability to exercise control and influence. So we have some folks that we look at their EMSs and they have put a limit on their physical boundary. So they may have a portion of their site where they've leased that out for a cell tower, or you know, they've got Duke Energy's transformer on part of their site. So there are different areas where you may want to physically exclude part of your organization, or if you're one of those organizations that's implementing your EMS in stages where only certain organizations are going to be in the EMS to start with, you can do it through your scope by saying, oh, you know, only X, Y, and Z are under our EMS. You know, T and V are going to be implemented in the next, you know, 2 years or something along those lines. All right, so once your scope is defined, you need to ensure that all the activities, products, and services of your organization within those areas are included in the scope. Your scope shall be maintained as documented information. So this is the first place that we see something has to be documented. And as I noted earlier, your scope must be available to those interested parties that you've identified. You have to consider the extent of your control or influence that you can exert over your activities, products, and services using the life cycle perspective. And just remember, you choose the scope of your EMS. So, you know, if there's any reason for you to exclude anything, please do that. And a lot of times when we come out and look at our, you know, during our functional equivalent audits, we will mention that to you if we see something. Or if you're a member, you just want assistance with your EMS, we can look at that too. All right, so the last section of section 4 is 4.4, where it says to achieve the intended outcomes, including enhancing your environmental performance, the organization shall establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve an EMS, including the processes needed and their interaction. So in this version of the standard, they put in some of these like higher overarching statements, and it's just a way really, I think, one, to allow an auditor to reference this if they, you know, if they get a feeling that something's not quite right, they may reference this section. And then the other part of 4, it says organizations shall consider the knowledge gained by your evaluations of your context and those needs and expectations of interested parties when establishing and maintaining the EMS. So always thinking back to how you affect the environment affects you, internal, external, those interested parties, and how that affects how your EMS is implemented. All right, so that's section 4. Okay, the next section is leadership, which is also new. So 5.1 is leadership and commitment. Environmental policy, that was in 2004, and then organizational roles and responsibilities was also in prior versions of the standard. All right, so leadership. I think everyone knows that if you have an EMS at your organization, that it is not successful without commitment from all levels and functions of top management. And I think this was also put in, sometimes in some organizations, you'll see that a lot of an EMS was put on one person to make it successful. And when that person left the organization, the EMS sort of floundered or failed altogether. So this is a way for the folks that came up with the international standard to circle back and say, hey, you know, it's everyone within the organization that needs to chip in, make sure everyone's working to make the EMS successful. All right, and we went over before in the terms of what top management is. And they have the power to delegate authority and provide resources within the organization, but they keep the accountability, which I'll talk about in a minute. All right. So basically, I just said this, you know, top management should direct the organization and be personally involved in specific responsibilities related to your EMS. So they can delegate responsibilities, but they must retain accountability for ensuring the actions are performed. Okay. So the standard says top management shall demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to the EMS. And I'll read through these. There's about 9 of them, so just bear with me. So taking accountability for the effectiveness of the EMS, ensuring the environmental policy and objectives, or what we consider goals, are established and compatible with the strategic direction and that context of the organization, ensuring the integration of the EMS requirements into the organization's business processes, ensuring that the resources needed for the EMS are available, communicating the importance of effective environmental management and of conforming to the EMS's requirements, ensuring that the EMS achieves its intended outcomes, directing and supporting persons to contribute to the effectiveness of the EMS, promoting continual improvement, and supporting other management, usually what you would consider maybe middle managers in an organization, in demonstrating leadership as it applies to their areas of responsibility. So I mentioned there are 9 different items here that are required by the standard. And so one of the ways that we have seen this implemented, so some folks will mention top management requires in that EMS manual. We have also seen it in specific procedures that are put in place. One of our members has developed a video that they want to let, and I may get this wrong, Angela, correct me if I do. I think they go through training to understand what their requirements are, but then let's see, the EPA facility, they created a video where top management then goes about talking about how important it is for everyone at the facility to engage in the EMS. And when we come out and do a functional equivalent audit, we specifically ask to have a meeting with top management. And we may not go through all 9 of these specific questions, but we'll ask them questions, you know, how do they make the decision of, you know, what are going to be the goals, the objectives for the facility? How do you determine the budget that's set for the projects that you put in place? You know, let's say, so one of the ways that middle managers can demonstrate their leadership, you know, Angela will talk to this in a couple days, the corrective action process. And why am I not remembering what the R is for? Cars. You know, are the managers of a let's say you found an area that needs improvement. Is the manager in that area doing what they need to do to fix the issue? Are they demonstrating their leadership related to their EMS? All right. So I've already given the answer away here. There is not a documentation piece, and I discussed different ways that you could put that into your EMS if you wanted to document it. Or it could just be that you discuss this as part of a meeting, a regular meeting, either your management meeting, or some folks have regular monthly meetings of an EMS team, or the person responsible for the, mainly responsible for the EMS with management So you could do it that way. And I just went through that we expect upper management to be interviewed during an audit as one of the ways to do this. So I was speaking to the EMS manual, so I believe this is Uchiyama again, where they talk about management responsibility in their EMS manual. So they talk about their CEO, their vice president, and I'm not remembering what the red was. I have to go back and look at that. All right. So policy. Angela, I believe you're going to discuss policy, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So when we first took the new standard, the 2015 version, we broke it up between 3 of us, and so that's how you hear who's speaking about what. So this is like 2 slides, and then it's going to go back to Marcia. So if you wonder why, it's just because of how we split up the standard when we first read it out. So policy is not new to this the standard. I think it's been in every version in some way or another. If you have a system in place already, then you probably already have a policy that's close to meeting the standard. With just a little bit of tweaking, you can upgrade it to the 2015 version easily. So what the standard says is top management shall establish, implement, and maintain an environmental policy within the scope. So you have to look at that scope piece that Marcia was just talking about and make sure you're not going way outside of that. You want to make sure that you're staying within your scope when you develop a policy. So if your scope is your campus minus that transformer, you don't want to talk about how you're going to improve the entire universe. So just make sure that it's things that you can actually accomplish within your organization. You need to make sure that it's appropriate to the purpose and context of that organization, that it provides a framework for setting those environmental objectives. And then here's the little change up from the last time. It includes a commitment to protection of the environment, including prevention of pollution and other specific commitments relevant to the organization. So in the past versions of the standard, it said you had to commit to preventing pollution. This actually broadens that into protecting the environment, including prevention of pollution. So it's just a little bit broader than it was before. A lot of folks already had some statement within their policy that basically said this. So just be aware that that has shifted slightly. It also includes a commitment to fulfill your compliance obligations. In the former version, this said your legal and other, but as Marcia mentioned, compliance obligations include both those legal and other commitments that you have made. And then it also includes a commitment to continual improvement of the EMS, which is what an EMS is all about. You remember that dimming cycle I showed you at the beginning, how that whole cycle, if you continue to do that, will give you continual improvement of that EMS. So your policy shall be maintained as documented information. So that means it has to be written down. In the past, it had to be shared, and a lot of people use that as a public sharing. So they either put it on their website, or I know some folks that back in the day actually published it in newspapers to show that they actually had their policy. Now you can maintain it as documented information and make it available to interested parties by putting a statement within your EMS that says it's available upon request. That is to those external interested parties. Internally, there will be a requirement that I think Dawn will talk about later, that it has to be communicated internally to the appropriate folks. So just be aware that it's not nearly as proactive as it used to be. However, scope, which didn't used to have to be shared with interested parties, now does. So those are the only 2 things that actually have to be shared externally if requested. All right, so Marcia, can you go to the next one for me? Thank you. So this is just summing it up. I really love the quote, so that's the main reason I keep 2 slides on the management policy. So there's a difference between interest and commitment. When you're interested in doing something, you only do it when it's convenient, and when you're committed to something, you accept no excuses, only results. And that kind of plays to this entire new version of the standard. Remember, Marcia talked about sustainability being a big piece of it, and that management and leadership now has to show a lot more commitment than they did in the past. In the past, they could basically delegate somebody to do everything for them, and then they could step back. But now they have to take ownership. So what we're looking at here is, with this policy, that you're showing those commitments, not that you're showing your interest in having an environmental management system. So there you go. Marcia, back to you.
All right, thank you, Angela. Okay, the last part of section 5 of the standard discusses the organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities. And so the standard says top management shall ensure the responsibilities and authorities for relevant roles are assigned and communicated within the organization. And a lot of ways you'll see that is either through a job description or spelled out within an SOP. And it also says that top management shall assign the responsibility and authority for ensuring the EMS conforms to the ISO 14001 standard and for reporting on performance of the EMS to top management. We'll talk about this going forward. In the older versions, they defined what was called an environmental management representative, or an EMR. So a lot of you may have heard that term before. The new standard gets rid of that term, but we tell folks that if you have an EMS in place and you've upgraded to the standard, you can keep whatever verbiage or language that your organization and everyone in it is used to. You don't have to take it out just because the standard changed. If it's working for you, we're all about not making changes. All right. Okay. So with that, we've actually covered a little early everything we wanted to for day 1. So does anybody have any questions about what we discussed today? Need clarification on any of the concepts? Feel free either to raise your hand or to type something in the question box. All right, so it's not looking like we have anything.
Nope, not seeing anything right now.
Okay.
So tomorrow, it's going to be a longer day, I'll tell you that now. We're going to do all of the planning piece, so all of clause 611 through 622. So we're going to do risks and opportunities, aspects and impacts, life cycle, compliance obligations, and objectives. So all of that's going to be tomorrow. So we're trying to, while we hit you with a fire hose, we're trying to break it down into some more bite-sized chunks for you.
And Angela and Marcia, we do have a few questions and comments that just came through.
Yeah.
One is from Sydney Swain. This was pretty straightforward. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Gustavo, will we be able to get a copy of the presentation?
Yes, and Angela, are we just going to send that out via the webinar software where it allows us to send it to everybody?
Yes, yeah, so we will send it to everybody who's registered, and each one of them will send out. I think I mentioned this up top, but you might not have been on at the time. We don't actually edit the webinars in-house. The Waste Reduction Partners helps us with that, so it may take a couple of days for it to come out, but you'll definitely get copies of both the recording and the slides themselves, and then any any of the handouts that we don't attach within the software, we will also forward to you. So like Marcia's completed version of the context. So
okay, and we have a few more questions, and we do have a hand raised. Let me go to the hand raise real quick. That's from Cara Lucas. Cara, whoops. let's see. It says you cannot be unmuted until you enter your PIN. So if you want to go to the question box or enter a PIN, you could try it again.
Yep. And then I see Bruce's question, is there
Yep.
a statutory requirement for an EMS? So there is not a statutory requirement for an EMS. However, if you are an entity of the federal government, there is a federal executive order for them to implement EMSs. And a lot of times, I think when we go over sort of background of an EMS, Angela, you speak to this, but a lot of it's customer driven. So the automotive industry, they started out as one of the big proponents for implementing EMS with the big three, and then they require that of their suppliers. Angela, and correct me if I'm wrong, it goes down 3 levels, 2 levels or 3 levels of a supplier automotive industry.
It's at least 2, and
Yeah.
then it kind of depends on what the next level is. So yeah.
Yep. And then what was another reason? So you could be required as part of an enforcement action. So where I used to work in New York, I worked for one of the Department of Energy National Research Labs. And back in the late 1990s, we had a multimedia inspection by EPA. And they had found some issues. And one of the ways they decided for us to correct those actions was to put an EMS in place. So I think we implemented in 1999. We were the first of the 9 national research laboratories to put that in. And I think there was also an entity, one of our members had an EMS put in place, either a suggested or a requirement that came out from a compliance issue.
Mm-hmm.
Angela, any other things that I have forgotten about? Ways to require an EMS?
Yeah, so I think you hit the ones that require it, and then there are folks that do it voluntarily just because they're looking for a better way to manage all of their environmental issues and making sure that they get that continuous improvement going within their culture shift. So just because you don't have a requirement to put one in doesn't prevent you from putting one in. So
Right. Yeah. So I think
definitely
at least one, they're a steward. One of our stewards, they saw the opportunity. They're a municipal organization, and after they implemented their EMS, they had much better environmental compliance.
Mhm. We had
So
several that did that, and we had some that they implemented an environmental management system that was based on an industrial work group kind of that has created their own.
right.
And then when we went in and did a functionally equivalent analysis of that, it was missing a few pieces from ISO, and they chose to add those pieces on because they wanted a more robust system. So, it can be as complex or as simple as you want it to be. We just focus on the ISO 14001 model because that's the internationally recognized one.
Yeah, and for those of you who are not ESI members, the reason we keep speaking to this functionally equivalent audit is that anyone can come into the ESI at the partner level, but if you want to move up to either a rising steward or steward, you either have to show that you have an outside certification of an EMS, or we can come in and do what we call that functional equivalent audit and deem your system equivalent for us for you to move up in our membership.
Yep.
All right.
So,
let's see.
are there
Is there
any
another
other
question?
questions?
Oh, one I believe you touched on from Julian Mercer. When will this recording be available?
Okay.
I think we mentioned we're working on those options. And Gustavo sent a big thank you.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. And we'll be back on tomorrow. Like I said, we're trying to break it up into a little bit more bite-sized chunks. We typically do this over the course of 2 full days here in the office. And so we're trying to figure out where the good breaks are as far as doing this online. So thank you for your patience with that as we figure it out too. But yeah, we're definitely going to send out the recordings and the slides. Like I said, it may be a few days just because we edit off our conversations and stuff in our like 30 minutes or so before we actually start the broadcast.
Yeah, we come
and
early.
and then any of this kind of chatting afterwards. So, all right. So we'll see you guys all tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel. You use the same link that you used today, and we'll be back in, and we'll talk to you at 1 o'clock tomorrow.
All right. Everybody have a good evening.
Yeah.